It is opening night in the NHL for the Edmonton Oilers, and these are the big storylines for the 2024-2025 NHL season.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. Happy opening night to everyone who is listening. I am your host, Nick Zararis, and I want to thank everyone who is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So today's episode, we are going to go through the big picture storylines for the Edmonton Oilers that are going to ultimately define the upcoming season. So our first segment, we are going to start with talking about the team's defense because there's a lot of plot lines to tug on in there. Our second segment, we're going to talk about year two, the first full season of Kris Knoblauch as Oilers head coach, the varying plot lines there. And then our final segment, we are going to talk about that burden of expectation, what coming into the season as the Stanley Cup favorite does to a team, how it impacts a team both on the ice, the decision makers, how they want to handle the course of the season, the trade deadline, etc. So to set the table, we all know this. We are looking at this roster. We are trying to poke holes in it. If you are like me, you are preparing yourself for the worst case scenario always. So that way you are prepared internally, emotionally, psychologically. If you are bracing yourself for the worst case scenario because you have pre-existing trauma from sports, you're like me. You think about, well, if the Oilers aren't going to win the Stanley Cup, what's not going to go right for them? And then you're going to think, well, they almost won the Stanley Cup last year, but their defense's inability to play good transition hockey against a good Panthers team was ultimately their undoing. It whittled them away over the course of a 7-game series. Of course, they orchestrated a furious, one of the most remarkable comebacks in the history of hockey just to get to a Game 7. But in looking at this defense, I think my biggest and the first plot line, how long does it take for things to gel? And I say gel because how long does it take for Emberson and Nurse to figure each other out? How long does it take Kulak and Stetcher to figure each other out? And then there's more layers as you peel this back. So number one, is Ty Emberson an NHL regular? He is 24 years old. He only has 30 NHL games played. Now, there are players who from time to time slip through the cracks, and Emberson has been in 3 different NHL organizations, the Oilers being his third, both the Rangers and the Sharks. The Rangers, a little less inclined to give right-handed defensemen a shot over the last handful of seasons. They've got a very jam-packed right-handed defenseman pipeline, I guess you would call it, of Adam Fox, Jacob Trouba, Braden Schneider, Tony DeAngelo. They have had a litany of right-handed defensemen over the last handful of seasons, so there wasn't really a path to the NHL for Ty Emberson. So it makes sense that the Rangers didn't really put a priority on his development. The Sharks, however, for a team like the Sharks that very clearly is in a rebuild that needs to figure out how they get from building to competitive, for a team like the Sharks to not give Emberson a serious long look tells me one of two things. Either A, there's nothing here, that Emberson is not somebody worth this opportunity, or B, which I think is more likely, the Sharks missed something in their evaluation, or the Oilers have identified something in their Emberson evaluation that they think they can bring out of him. And when we talk about these targeted, specialized skill sets, we talk about pro scouting departments identifying something or one particular trait that a player is good at, and then putting him in a position where all they need to do is that one thing. That makes sense. I can buy the Oilers think they see something in Emberson's game that the Sharks and the Rangers didn't. Building off of that further, how long is it going to take for Nurse and Emberson to click as a defensive pair? Are the Oilers inclined to give them a while to figure it out because it's a long regular season? Or, and this is going to tie into our second segment as far as Kris Knoblauch pushing the right buttons, Or are the Oilers going to say, well, if this isn't working, let's do Nurse with Bouchard, let's do Ekholm with Emerson, and let's see if we can get by with that. How quick is it going to be before the Oilers say, well, this isn't working? Or are the Oilers going to say, well, this isn't working so far, but we want to give them some time to figure it out? Because, and this is true of Kulak with Stetcher as well, I want to understand what the Oilers' expectations are. And I want Ekholm and Bouchard to be the best pair in hockey. There's a strong argument they are the best first pair in the entire NHL entering this upcoming season, but there are only so many minutes in a game. And if you have to choose between playing your best guys 26, 27 minutes a night in the regular season versus breaking them up and distributing your talent a little more evenly through your lineup so there's less of a drop-off from pair to pair to get more average results over the course of an entire game as opposed to dominating those 24, 25 minutes Ekholm and Bouchard get and then trying to survive those other 35-ish minutes your other two pairs are dividing, that's a calculation the Oilers are going to need to make. And so much of playing defense in the NHL is instinctual, meaning that you're only going to get better by get better through repetitions. That's why traditionally defensemen develop slower than forwards, because there are a lot more variables that go into how a defenseman plays. You need to learn how your partner plays. You need to learn the boards in every rink because different boards have different lively spots where the puck's going to bounce off them differently. You need to understand how opposition forechecks work, how opposition cycles work to be able to intercept the angles and play those off. You need to have an intuitiveness to understanding how a player moves when they're coming at you, if they're inclined to dip to the outside, cut to the middle, if they're going to shoot. And it takes time to get that inherent instinct within you to have that attack, to have the means of knowing everything, because it's a lot to know. It's not quite learning a playbook in football, but it's the same concept. You want to understand how teams are trying to attack you so that you can mitigate those factors. And that the fact the Oilers are giving Emerson second pair minutes out of the gate off rip, that tells me they think he can do this, or that he has the ability that maybe they can bring something else out of him that they have yet to have. It is encouraging because it shows that they trust their pro scouting department, which is something that some teams don't do a great job of. And then it also tells me that they think Nurse is salvageable. And this will be the last point in this opening segment, but the Oilers are never going to get excess value on that Nurse contract. I think Nurse becoming an unrestricted free agent when he did was a perfect storm for Nurse in terms of maximizing his value. The contracts that had been doled out to defensemen in recent seasons before that extension, like Seth Jones, like Adam Fox, it set the market for a first pair defenseman at a high number. And Nurse had a career high in points that season, and it was a perfect storm to get paid. And very quickly, the Oilers have realized, well, he's not that guy. They've addressed that. They've since gotten Ekholm. Bouchard has come out of his shell and really emerged as a top 1 percentile defenseman in the entire NHL. But they need more from Darnell Nurse, and hopefully Ty Emerson is the one who can bring it out of him. We're going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to tackle the Kris Knoblauch storylines. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. If you're like me, you like getting out there to events, whether it's games, whether it's concerts. The only place I buy tickets to get out there is from our friends over at Gametime. With some of the best features in the ticket buying experience, things like the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. My personal favorite, the most important feature in my opinion, the seat view. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. You're going to a game, you're going to an Oilers game, and you want to get an idea of the sight lines. Are you looking for the red light because you're not going to be able to see behind the goalie? Or are you going to be able to see the puck hit the back of the net so you can jump out of your seat and go absolutely nuts. The Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Thank you to everyone who is tuned in for this opening night edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are diving into the most important storylines of the Oilers season. Next up on the docket, talking about Kris Knoblauch going into his first full season as an NHL head coach. And the Oilers, in bringing in an interim coach when they did last season in early November, it gave them a few things. Number one, it really gave them a all hands on deck mindset. When you bring in a coach in the middle of a season, it is a real kick in the butt. It is an affirming, hey, we expect more from you. This is the guy who brings it out of you. If he doesn't get more out of you, then we're going to have to start making more drastic decisions. And when a team is in the kind of hole the Oilers were in, and lest we forget the hole they were in early November, where they came out of the gate very slowly. You'll remember Ekholm was injured during the preseason, didn't get a full preseason. Connor McDavid, a little overworked in the offseason, did a little too much in his training, wasn't fully healthy, dinged himself up a little bit, missed a few games at the start of the last season, and it took him a little while to really get going to what we expect from Connor McDavid. So when you have that coach come in and you're into the fire right away, it activates that fight or flight and really locks you in as a team and really pushes your boundaries as what you can do. It really pushes you to be better. It really pushes you to I can't worry about tomorrow. We got to play right now. You can't coach for tomorrow. You got to play for right now. And the way last season went, you have to give Kris Knoblauch the benefit of the doubt. We can talk about the playoff decision-making, giving Skinner those 2 games where they went to Pickard in the Vancouver series, and Skinner got a good, hard mental reset. He came back in, was significantly better, put away the Canucks series, outplayed Jake Ottinger in the conference finals, and was pretty good in the Cup final against Florida. In all honesty, I didn't feel that Stuart Skinner was the difference between the Oilers winning and losing the Stanley Cup. If anything, like I said in the first segment, it was the defense's inability to go from defense to offense quickly and forcing Skinner to do more than you would expect from him. You'll remember, if you were listening to the show during the Cup final, as I said, if Stuart Skinner is just all player on the team, the Oilers will be fine. If the Oilers are expecting him to be the difference between winning and losing, then they're setting themselves and Skinner up for failure. And luckily, the Oilers didn't do that. Ultimately, Stuart Skinner was not the issue. And in this case, understanding your guys, the buttons to push, scratching Cody Ceci for a game, moving Darnell Nurse down to the third pair, bringing Philip Broberg into the lineup. Those are all indications of a player of a coach who understands the buttons to press to bring the best out of people. And so much of coaching in today's sports world is about the person-to-person connection. Every player is different. The my way or the highway, one-size-fits-all style of coaching that we all got from people's dads playing Little League baseball and Pee-wee hockey and Pee-wee football, that doesn't really work anymore. Because these athletes are so specialized, they are so talented, and frankly, they are paid so well, they are not going to take that nonsense. They want to build a relationship. They want to feel like the coach is on their side, that the coach understands them and can bring the best out of them. And that is not something every coach is capable of. It is uncommon for coaches to really find those people skills, those communication skills, if they don't naturally have them. Sure, there are some coaches who do better in a second or a third or even a fourth stop around the NHL, but for the most part, effective communicators, strong leaders, you think about the Mike Sullivans of the world, you think about the Jim Montgomerys of the world, Pete DeBoer, John Cooper, Jared Bednar. You think about the various coaches who have managed to stay in one place for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Those are the types of guys who, regardless of what you give him in the locker room, he's going to be able to foster an environment that brings guys the best out of guys. And that's really one of the keys. When you are dealing with such a long season, and we're going to talk about some of the decisions Knoblauch has to make over the course of a long season, and we alluded to one in the first segment, but when you have to manage a 6.5 month regular season of 82 regular season games, and then a 2.5 month playoff run, there is a lot you're going to need to balance. There are the short-term considerations, the medium-term, and the long-term considerations. One of those decisions, how many minutes is too many minutes for Ekholm and Bouchard? If our second and third pairs are struggling, how many minutes can we realistically give Ekholm and Bouchard in the regular season where they're still going to be effective? That's number one. Number two, how much can you realistically give those guys as far as a leash? How much work can you give Bouchard and Ekholm while still trying to balance Emberson, Stetcher, Nurse, Kulak? There are a lot of factors to balance out, a lot of factors to consider. I like where the Oilers are at as far as decision making. I said this yesterday, and I'll say it again now. The Oilers waiving Josh Brown tells me that the Oilers understand the expectations afforded to them this season, the responsibilities of what those expectations bring with them, and trying to maximize the opportunities in front of them. Because when the Oilers have their machine, their operation going at full speed, this is one of the best teams in the entire NHL. What does that mean as far as how the Oilers go from here? Well, the coaching decision-making is very straightforward. Most of this lineup is going to sort itself out pretty straightforward. It is a matter of, can Kris Knoblauch understand what decisions he needs to make, when he needs to make them, and how those decisions are going to impact the team. We understand that he is a very deferential is the word I'm going to use as far as incorporating McDavid, his captain's decision-making and his opinion in things, which you should. Connor McDavid's the best player in the world. He's the captain of your team. He's going to be the face of your franchise for the rest of the decade once that contract gets sorted out. And because of that, it puts the Oilers in a position where there's a lot of weight on a handful of guys because they are a top-heavy team. Managing how much we want to put our pedal to the floor is going to be imperative because it is such a long season, because we have a 6.5 month regular season and then a 2.5 month postseason. With all of that in mind, we are going to take our final break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to talk about what that grind, what that burden of expectations does, and how the Oilers go about handling it. Coming up next on this edition of Locked On Oilers. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. This week in the NFL, tomorrow night, Thursday Night Football, 49ers at the Seahawks, the Niners 3.5-point road favorites. Another London game this week, the Jaguars and the Bears going at it at Tottenham Stadium. The Jaguars 1.5-point underdogs. The best game on the ledger this week is probably Cardinals at Packers. Kyler Murray and the Cardinals going up to Green Bay, coming off of their big win over the 49ers, 5.5-point road underdogs. And then Sunday Night Football, the New York Football Giants at home hosting Joe Burrow and the Bengals. The Giants 3.5-point home underdogs. If you want to get in on the action, go visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are setting the table for the 2024-2025 NHL season. And look, we all know the Oilers came that close to winning the Stanley Cup. I've alluded to it before, but I don't imagine there's been a day since Game 7 of the Cup final where Connor McDavid hasn't thought about that sequence where he had the puck one-on-one with Bobrovsky, and I believe it was Brandon Montour was able to get his stick on McDavid's stick, so McDavid wasn't able to get a shot off. And when you are that close, you come back even more determined. And McDavid's had a lot over the last year. The injury to start last year, the crazy regular season to get 100 assists, first guy to do it, I want to say it was 20-something years. You talk about that. You talk about the grind of that playoff run, the range of emotions that encompass that playoff run, losing the Stanley Cup final, winning the Rocket Richard for not the Rocket Richard, excuse me, winning the Conn Smythe for playoff MVP on a losing team. First guy to do it in almost 20 years. You talk about that. You talk about the life stuff that happened in the offseason. He got married and came back to Edmonton a little bit early to start working on this grind. And with that in mind, we talked about this a few weeks ago, the idea of the superhero player coming back with the man on the mission mentality. LeBron, after losing to the Mavericks in 2011, coming back and winning the title the next year with the Heat. We talk about Tom Brady going out in the first round against Tennessee with New England, going to Tampa Bay, coming back and winning the Super Bowl next year. We talk about Stafford getting traded from the Lions to the Rams, man on the mission, winning the Super Bowl. That is the type of expectation here. There is an honest to God expectation that the Oilers are going to respond to losing the Stanley Cup final by coming back and winning it the next year. And it doesn't happen often. It did happen last year where Florida had lost to Vegas the previous season, came back and won the Stanley Cup the year after. That is not a common occurrence. We don't see teams be able to put that together because of the miles. You think about the 82 regular season games, you're talking about at minimum, realistically, another 18 or so playoff games on top of that. You're talking about 100 games in 9 months. You get a month and a half off. You really start ramping up your training in August so that by the middle of September, you're ready for preseason testing to come back. All of that accumulates. It is very hard to bounce back from losing a Stanley Cup final. The Oilers have made some tactical decisions. They opted for a little bit more offense and conceded defense, even though defense was the weak point of their team last season. They have opted to lean on veteran experience. They're the oldest roster in the NHL entering this season. They have opted to trust their professional scouting department in leaning on Stetcher and Emberson to be able to get a little bit more maybe out of Kulak and Nurse. They have put a lot on the plate of Kris Knoblauch to manage all of these expectations in only his second year, first full season as an NHL head coach. And with all of that in mind, the burden of what those expectations bring is real. How much can you play McDavid and Draisaitl in the regular season? How much can you play Ekholm and Bouchard in the regular season? How much can you play Stuart Skinner in the regular season? How long can you give Bouchard and Ekholm as a pair if Emberson and Nurse are stinking, or if Stetcher and Kulak, excuse me, it took me a second to think of Brett Kulak's name. How long do you give them if they're stinking? How does Travis Dermott fit into this? When does he get a first real audition to play with somebody if one of the right-handed defensemen is struggling? How many starts can you give Stuart Skinner this year? Can you give him 55, 60 regular season starts? Is that feasible? What's that going to do to his playoff readiness if you give him 55 to 60 regular season starts? All of this has to be in the back of Kris Knoblauch's mind. And on top of that, you have an Evander Kane return sometime in February, and you're going to have to add at the deadline because we know the Oilers are a defenseman short. They have enough forward talent where on any given night, they'll beat anyone. They can beat anyone. They are talented enough to beat anyone any given night. In the regular season, the Oilers' B- effort should win them 43 games with the talent they have. That you don't want to get into that habit, but the Oilers, even with bad habits, are going to win a lot of regular season games. But when the expectation is to win the Stanley Cup, the regular season kind of takes the back burner and it becomes an evolving storyline. It becomes an evolving plot arc of, well, if the end goal is to win the Stanley Cup, how realistic is that based on X, Y, and Z? If they get off to a great start and, they come out of the gate 15-4-3 and they're really rolling and the offense is clicking, the defense is minimizing the mistakes, they're outscoring a lot of their issues, the power play comes out of the gate, 25.5%, 26% that first few weeks of the season. Everything looks great. How do the Oilers improve? How do they maintain a hunger to themselves? And I'll leave you with this parting thought before we get out of here on today's episode. When teams go on long playoff runs, they come back at the start of the following season with that, all right, can we get to the playoffs already mindset? And when you have that mindset, it becomes very easy to develop bad habits, to think, oh, well, we're going to make the playoffs. This doesn't matter all that much. And that is not an active decision. That is, it is 2:30 on a Friday and I'm not doing anything at work the last 30 minutes type decision. It is a subconscious understanding of the reality of the expectations, because the Oilers, it doesn't matter if they win 45, 55 regular season games. It doesn't matter. The more games they win, the more it helps them, I suppose. But I think the key for this season is finding that middle ground. Not too high, not too low. You want to be able to respond to strong situations. You want to be able to reply to weak situations. And with all of that in mind, you are now set for the 2024-2025 Edmonton Oilers season. I want to thank everyone who made today's show their first listen. Before we get out of here, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening over on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Leave me a comment. What storyline are you most curious about for the upcoming season? Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. Now go check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey to get set for the fantasy hockey season. I will talk to you guys tomorrow after the Oilers' first game of the season. See you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.